English translation, 712th Contact Part 1. Wednesday, the 28th of November 2018, 9:57 hours.
There you are. Be greeted and welcome, dear friends.
Be greeted as well, Edward, my friend. I also greet you, my friend, but I want to go out right away and look at all the work you have done, after which I want to discuss my findings with you.
Of course, knock yourself out.
What do you mean by that?
It is just such a speech that we use that says you can do as you see fit without restraint, and according to your own discretion, sense, and ability.
I did not know this idiom, but I find it good according to your explanation. But now I am leaving and will come back later.
And away he goes. But that immediately brings up the question for me. How is actually the heart-hand sign to be assessed? Which the German Chancellor Merkel always makes. If you can judge that, as your father Twelfth could, and understood to judge from the hand and finger postures of the human beings, their character and their being, etc.
The hand, heart, and finger posture of Mrs., whom you mentioned, means the heart-shaped finger holding and the simultaneous fingertip touching of the middle and ring fingers is done unconsciously, indicates sectarianism, and also means that this person is boundlessly obsessed with domination and power, self-important, praise-seeking, unquestioningly purposeful in every respect, in her personal actions only concerned with herself and her well-being, as well as unpredictable and irresponsible in rash decisions and actions.
Thanks. I will have to remember that. And to which I think especially what you said about the last words also relates to her welcoming culture, as well as what you said about being unthinkingly purposeful in her personal actions. When I relate that to what you said to me earlier about her but explaining some more might shed some more light on it. I still have the question of how the heart-hand sign that the German Chancellor Merkel always makes is to be evaluated in even better execution and explanation. This is because, in contrast to our idiotic psychologists and other psychologists and psychiatrists, etc., by which I mean only those who know better, who complicate everything but know nothing, who are absolute rascals in this field and yet know better. You can judge this from your best professional experience and clear view and your knowledge of the finger positions of human beings. You have already proved this to me many times, just as your father Twelfth was able and understood to read and judge the character and nature of human beings from their hand and finger positions. So I would now like to know from you how this heart-hand sign is to be evaluated. For my part, I have learned quite a bit from Twelfth in this respect, precisely in relation to finger and hand postures, etc., but I think that you, as a learned person and precisely as a real expert in this field, can judge the whole thing better than I can, because I am not specially versed in this respect, but only use my learnt knowledge for my home use.
How do you always say one should not hide one's light under a bushel? You know what I mean by that? But as far as the hand and finger position of Merkel, whom you mentioned, is concerned, this is to be interpreted in terms of depth psychology. This means that all psychological and psychotherapeutic approaches must be combined, because only the values that emerge from them together reveal the unconscious psychological processes through which human behavior and experience can first be given a high status in explaining the whole of what is to be judged. The central aspect of the evaluation of what you are asking about, that is to say, the holding of the heart, as you call it, is to be sought under the surface of consciousness and the resulting thoughts and their feelings, and thus in the deep layers of the psyche, in which further unconscious processes take place that very strongly influence conscious psyche life. And when I say the conscious psyche life, then the conscious is to be understood as a thought-feeling-action factor, consequently.
Excuse me if I interrupt you, because I would like to understand what the conscious means as a thought-feeling-action factor, because when I try to comprehend these words, then I understand by it not something conscious and thus not conscious action, but simply a thought-feeling action, which is however carried out or done unconsciously and thus not consciously. Thus, for me, the conscious psyche life simply results as an independent factor, which I can only define in relation to the conscious as the existence and presence of the psyche state, which makes itself felt in such a way that out of it, As the last fact, action is taken automatically, but effectively without conscious thoughts and feelings, whereby the conscious psyche life, or precisely its conscious, only embodies the actual psyche state, but not a conscious action.
That is correct. And consequently, I can also interpret the answer to your question in the following wise. The heart-shaped finger holding and the simultaneous fingertip touching of the middle and ring fingers is done unconsciously and expresses a behavior that is supposed to conceal the attitude of an extremely strong moral wrongness. Furthermore, this is also intended to gloss over, pretend and thus prevent, conceal the hidden deep lying, domineering and guileful pretense, and also to place the whole mendacity through the heart-shaped finger holding in a light of unreserved trust, as well as unhesitating honesty and conciseness. Furthermore, the whole of this heart-shaped finger holding indicates sectarianism, and also states that this person is unboundedly obsessed with domination and power, self-important, self-laudatory, praise-seeking, and also in every respect unhesitatingly purposeful in their personal and overall environment-related actions only concerned with themselves and their well-being, and is also unpredictable and irresponsible in unthinking decisions and actions.
Thanks. I must remember that. And in addition, I think that with regard to your last words, which you said, this also refers especially to Merkel's welcome culture, through which she has caused and conjured up the streams of refugees, for which she can neither bear responsibility, nor have negative consequences for her arisen from it. Because those in bondage to her are just as stupid, primitive, and irresponsible, do not want to lose their jobs and play along with the monopoly of power. In the case of Merkel, who is obsessed with power, everything relates, as you said, to her unhesitatingly purposeful personal actions, namely that she infatuates all her followers with her suggestive behavior and makes them her slaves, who, in their lowly intelligentum, do not perceive the power game she is really running, and as a result of the dim-wittedness of her followers, basks in her own glory. If I relate this to what you told me earlier regarding her well-calculated behavior in relation to which then elevated her to the chancellorship with the help of... But let's leave that because I am interested in how it's going to go weather-wise in California when the forest fires are out. Do you have any predictive data through your apparatus yet?
Yes, and the weather conditions will be unpleasant. Because the foresight, our apparatuses have now been further developed and are now able to record specific events more than 92 days in advance, to which they can be directed. With regard to the coming natural events will be unpleasant. Of course, such events also include weather events, as our equipment also shows. Because after forest fires or other large fires, the forest fire areas or other large fire areas are flooded by rain flash floods or large rain masses, which also create small or large mud rolls. But this will not be anything unusual and therefore also not very important for the media if it happens in the Malibu and Paradise Fire area.
So first heat, forest fires, and then flash floods and waves of mud. But there is no need to be surprised, because it is actually normal that after a heat wave there will be rain. It is to be said, however, that the climate has been brought into turmoil and change by the machinations of overpopulation, which will result in many more and worse catastrophes in the future, and even worldwide, than the one that resulted from the forest fires. The greater and more extensive overpopulation becomes, the worse nature reacts to it with storms and natural disasters, because earthly humanity has still not understood that it is to blame for this as a result of the growing humanity, and that it is constantly causing more and more dangerous turmoil through its interfering machinations in nature. And the hammer is that it is still claimed that no machinations whatsoever can be traced back to the insanely increased world population, because all manipulations, dodges, maneuvers, practices, and other machinations in relation to the subversion of the laws of nature have nothing to do with manipulations regarding the destruction of the atmosphere, climate, nature, and its fauna and flora. But that is not all, because there is much more that needs to be said and that I want to take up and clarify today. For which I also want to add an overpopulation subject to what I have to say, which Occam Wolf has beamed to me. What the third millennium will now bring to the humanity of the Earth can be comprehensively predicted. For now, nothing can be changed about what will inevitably result in the future from the consequences of the overflowing overpopulation and its machinations. And this because the humanity of the Earth does not turn towards the truth of creation and its laws and recommendations, that is to say, recommendations, but continues to walk along a path of destruction and tramples underfoot what is good, better, and correct. The whole of humanity does not in any manner follow the rules of life as they exist in the creational laws, and which can be seen, grasped, and recognized in nature. Consequently, they could also be considered and understood by rationality and intellect, and thus fulfilled, but hardly any earthling is interested in this. And this only because they prefer to lead an irresponsible life of lottery, which is based on pleasure, selfishness, egoism, money-grabbing, religious delusion, and self-importance, as well as on enmity, hatred, disregard, and indifference, as well as dislike, etc., towards their neighbor. Differences of opinion, etc., have long been part of the daily disorder of the human beings of Earth. Consequently, no consensus can be found with regard to peace and freedom. The absolute majority of humanity is dominated by an all-encompassing destructive indifference, especially with regard to fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, but also with regard to life, the way of life, and the entire attitude towards life in general. This also results in the fact that no thought is given to the criminal growth of the Earth's population, and the great masses are of the erroneous opinion that the Earth, its nature, the atmosphere, and the climate, as well as all life, will continue to function and continue to exist if masses of offspring continue to be conceived and brought into the world. It is also not considered in any manner that due to the growth of population, the demand for food, at present humanity is growing by around 110 million per year, contrary to the lying statistics of the world population counters, is becoming ever greater. It has already been the case for decades that China, for example, is no longer able to feed its current population of around 1.4 billion by growing food in its own country, so that for the cultivation of natural foodstuffs in Africa, South America, Europe, and everywhere else, land or also food production companies have to be bought or leased in order to be able to feed the Chinese population. India also has the same problem with its current population of 1.37 billion. And this is in addition to all the other countries of the Earth, all of which are also overpopulated, including Switzerland, which today, in 2018, has a population of around 8.64 million, and which has therefore grown by more than 4 million from 4.6 million in just 67 years since 1951. And the fact that statisticians, etc., lie in black and white that the world population is decreasing and that there are fewer and fewer births in general, not only blows the lid off all the lies, but also blows the bottom out. And the fact that everything is also calculated wrongly with the so-called world population clock is also not taken into consideration, because how else could it be that this wrongly set human counting clock calculated the world population in October 2018 with only 7.63 billion human beings, while the Ptaah precisely accurate apparatuses list every single earthling individually and give extremely precise and incontrovertible information, which on the 31st of December 2017 at midnight was the number of human beings in the world. December 2017 at midnight, an extremely correct number of 8,844,128,002 Earth humans. But the fact that according to this effective fact, pathologically, that is to say pathologically stupidly, the UNO calculates a world population growth of about 78 million human beings per year for the period 2015 to 2020, although in reality about 110 million new descendants have been brought into the world per year for years, corresponds to more than just a malicious lie, deception, and stupidity towards humanity. Or perhaps it is the case that in relation to the reality recognition of those who claim this horrendously idiotic and catastrophically primitive stupid nonsense, the intellect, rationality, and intelligentum are so minimal that they are not even sufficient to be able to distinguish between black and white. And the fact that the United Nations only expects a population of about 9.7 billion on the globe by 2050 is probably the last bullshit prognosis and humanity stupid. Insane and lying assertion that a reasonable human being can just about bear with enormous effort and hardship without immediately going crazy and wanting to fry the dog and himself in the frying pan. If these imbeciles had even one iota of intellect, rationality and intelligentum, then it would dawn on them in their empty brains that since the 31st of December 1950, from an Earth population of 2,784,382,444 at that time, this has risen to 8,844,128,002 by the 31st of December 2017 in only 67 years, which corresponds to an increase of 6,059,745,558 human beings. This is contrary to another lie claiming that only 76 more million would be added annually. And if I take the data that I have recently taken from the internet, I have to say that these claims, lies, calculations, and assumptions stink to high heaven.
Internet excerpts, falling birth rates. But fortunately, the development is not unchecked. Very gradually, birth rates are falling. Whereas around 1950, a woman had an average of 5 children worldwide, between 1990 and 1995, the average was 3. Today, it is only 2.5. The United Nations assumes that the birth rate could drop to 2 children per woman by the end of the century. Then the so-called maintenance rate, and thus a reversal point, would be reached. If the birth rate still falls below this value, as expected, the world population will slowly decline again. 20 billion human beings by the end of the century? The 11th of July, World Population Day. On the 11th of July, 1987, there were 5 billion human beings on Earth. The United Nations took this as an opportunity to introduce International World Population Day. Not out of joy, but to slow down further growth as much as possible. Note Billy, Earth's population in the middle of 1987, according to Player and Data, 5,149,979,380. World Population Clock. How many human beings are there now? DSW.org. As of the first half of 2018, there are already more than 7.6 billion human beings living on Earth, half as many as just 30 years earlier. If this growth were to continue unchecked, it would soon become very crowded on our planet. If development remains completely unchanged, there could be around 20 billion human beings by the year 2100. Population forecasts until 2100, but until that time comes, the world's population will continue to grow significantly. In 2055, there will probably be 10 billion human beings in the world, and by 2100, there will be 11.2 billion. Assuming a reasonably favorable development of the birth rate. But if the birth rate remains at today's 2.5 children per woman, there will have to be room for 16.6 billion human beings.
Well, so much for that, but then the following.
The worldwide declining birth rate is just as much an impudent lie as also the listed number of earthly human beings, which at present is only 7,630,000,000 plus some, squashed, as also the Earth's population in 2055 is only supposed to be 11.2 billion and in 2100 only 16.6 billion human beings. The fact of the whole lying process is that the world population liars can neither count the world population nor estimate it correctly because they only proceed hypothetically and thus make idiotic assumptions. Because they do not have the possibility of clear technology, by which they could register every single individual even in the last hidden corner of the earth. And what is further to be said about this relates to the fact that by all that intelligent and in reality stupidly mendacious therefore fools and therefore fantasizers of the world population counters in relation to the growth of the earth's population, it is not considered at all that all those follies and machinations which continue to arise from the endless growth of global overpopulation make everything altogether worse and worse. This, for example, in the way that every year around, or more than, 100 million young female and male earthlings inevitably become capable of procreation, many of whom, just as inevitably, because it is natural and predetermined by nature, craft offspring, just as tens of millions of others continue to do, although they have already brought enough offspring into the world. Many simply want to expand, have their families without reason, to found families or to fulfill their wishes for children in a stupidly unthinking way, or God knows why. Simply not to use contraception, for some flimsy or completely idiotic reason, for example as a result of religious delusion, etc. with regard to the lying fantasy chronicle of the Bible. In this, the imbecile commandment in Genesis 9, one is fantasized that the imaginary Yahweh, that is to say God, invented by an insane earthling, is supposed to have said to Noah and his sons and blessed them with the words, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And this go and multiply has been taken seriously ever since, and is still taken seriously all over the world, and has found acceptance and practice in all religions, at least with regard to its execution, and indeed among all believers who have no direct or indirect reference to the Hebrew Jewish religious book Tanakh, in which the name of God is formed as an independent word from the Hebrew consonants Jod, He, Vav. Read from right to left, it results in the tetragram, YHWH, which is by far the most common biblical proper name. Note, tetragram equals quadruple sign, designation for the four Hebrew consonants JHWH of the name of God Yahweh as a symbol of God, which is also used to ward off evil. Furthermore, with regard to overpopulation, the death rate of human beings dying naturally or as a result of criminal and warlike machinations must be considered. But this does not make the frying pan fat with regard to a population reduction, because the natural regulation is unquestionable. Because logically, in the normal case, the relevant natural law is responsible for this and also works in such a way that the relationship between dying and living is kept within a balancing framework. However, because the procreation of offspring is carried out in excess, the production or the number of offspring increases immensely beyond the normal, as a result of which the total excessively increasing overpopulation mass far exceeds the normal mortality rate to a very high degree and drives it up ever further and more precariously. And here the factor of advanced medicine plays an exceptionally large role, because through it the natural mortality rate is reduced more and human beings are cured of otherwise fatal diseases and infirmities, as they are also kept alive longer and longer through life-sustaining transplants or implants or tissues, organs, organ parts or other materials implanted in the body, as well as microelectronic devices that take over certain functions in the body. Consequently, the natural death rate, as well as the death mass resulting from wars, acts of terrorism and other crimes occurring among mankind, is far and ever further undercut by the catastrophically increasing overpopulation that is kept alive longer and longer, whereby the Earth's population grows inexorably exuberantly, resulting in more and greater and more catastrophic problems that can no longer be overcome. Through the mass of the Earth's population, the individual human being will become more and more indifferent to his neighbor and less able to relate to him, for like the mass itself, the individual earthling will become an anonymous thing and a non-existence in relation to his neighbor and fellow human beings in general, because he himself will lose his own individuality and will no longer possess any personal honor, but will only be a shadow of himself, just as he will be nothing more than a soulless robot. The ever-increasing overpopulation gives rise to ever-new ruinous machinations of various kinds in relation to nature, its fauna and flora, and for the earth itself, whereby these manipulations, dodges, maneuvers and practices are intended to satisfy all conceivable needs, desires, and the striving for luxury of the ever-growing mass of earthlings. In particular, the exploitation of the Earth's resources, which erodes and ultimately dangerously disrupts the rotation of the planet, is a major concern. These machinations relate in particular to the exploitation or plundering of the Earth's petroleum for the production of fuel for motor vehicle traffic, which has long since become rampant and has reached a norm that can no longer be brought under control, but is expanding more and more, becoming more precarious, and ultimately can no longer be managed. The unstoppable increase in overpopulation requires more and more roads, extensions to airports, railway and tram lines, as well as the associated vehicles, aircraft, railways and trams, etc., due to the rapidly increasing volume of traffic of all kinds. But the longer the overpopulation goes on, the more it becomes impossible to cope with anything at all. As a result, for many years now the roads have been crammed with cars, buses, lorries, motorbikes, tractors and all kinds of other motor vehicles that emit CO2 and thus pollute and poison the atmosphere, to the detriment of the health of human beings as well as of the whole of nature and its fauna and flora. The railway lines are overloaded with trains, trams, and the sky or airspace is also largely overloaded with aeroplanes, a dangerous traffic route that also spreads all the pollutants far and wide in the atmosphere through CO2 emissions. But the oceans are also flooded with all kinds of ships that pollute the air and atmosphere with CO2, especially large cargo and passenger ships that run on heavy oil and are enormous polluters. This is in addition to the fact that irresponsible captains and ship crews dump masses of dirty oil and all kinds of other filth into the oceans, turning them into stinking and toxic rubbish waters and causing marine life to fall ill and die miserably, or, if fishermen catch them and then bring them into the trade and use them as food for human beings, they fall ill and may die as a result. Furthermore, this also includes the mining of precious rocks and very expensive, rare earths, but especially the overexploitation of all precious metals and ores, without which there would be neither vehicles nor electronics, surgical instruments, working machines, tools, hard cash, bridges, houses and other buildings and structures of all kinds, toys, musical instruments, transport railways of all kinds, wire and steel cables and countless other things and products. All these are human achievements that are indispensable in the modern world and in the absence of which humanity would be thrown back, if not exactly to the first age of grunting and yowling, then so far back that it would have to start completely from scratch in the most primitive way. The whole of nature, its fauna and flora, and also humanity itself, are being increasingly impaired in terms of health, respiration, well-being, viability, and the necessary free living space by the ever more blatant machinations and manipulations of the catastrophically increasing overpopulation. This is because all the prerequisites for a healthy life are being destroyed more and more radically and ultimately irreparably. The whole of nature and its fauna and flora, the tiniest rivulets of water, streams, rivers and seas, as well as the air, the atmosphere, the forests, floodplains, fields, meadows, steppes, tundras, moors, swamps, meadows, fields, horticultural areas and gardens of all kinds are being horribly and irreparably poisoned by toxins. And these toxins, which are applied in ever greater quantities and ever more frequently, turning plants and living beings into poison carriers, correspond to poisons that are becoming ever more destructive and exterminating. And the dangerous substances enter all gardens, plantations, horticultural farms, meadows, fields, and forests, as well as all fresh waters and seas, which become poison pits and thus carriers of disease, epidemics, and death. This is because the toxins accumulated in them are transferred to all cultivated or naturally grown plants and poison them from the ground up. The plant world absorbs the toxins via its food and the water in which the toxins and nutrients are enriched. Although toxins can also enter the plants via the leaves and the cuticle or outer skin or bark. Even though the leaves and outer skin also have the function of stomatal transpiration or the evaporation of water via their adjustable stomata. Thus, food intake in stationary plants is different from that in the locomotory life forms of fauna and human beings, who take in their food, which is poisoned as a result of the toxins deposited in all food, through eating. What happens in and with the plant world with regard to toxin applications also results in all seas and fresh waters, in which aquatic creatures serving as human food are bred and contaminated beyond repair by toxins and thus become toxin carriers to everything and anything in the waters. Nature, its fauna and flora as well as the human beings. All living creatures that eat meat from the toxin-infested aquatic life forms pollute their bodies in a way that is harmful to their health, as also happens through the secondary microplastics that float in the water a millionth of a tiny nanoscale and are ingested by the aquatic life forms with food and are deposited in the meat. These particles mix with the food of the aquatic life forms and pass into their flesh, which in turn serves as food for other life forms, including human beings. Secondary microplastics are formed in the environment by the decomposing primary macroplastics, which are solid and insoluble synthetic polymers or plastics smaller than 5 millimeters. The brittle and decomposing microplastic creates more and smaller plastic particles in the course of the decomposition process, which also attract all kinds of environmental toxins and are eaten by marine organisms. Moreover, it can no longer be removed from the environment because there is no earthly technology or any other way to do so. Secondary microplastics, ingested by aquatic organisms through food, are formed as tiny particles in water bodies from primary microplastics, which are broken down by brittleness, after which a following decomposition of the plastic parts finally occurs. Due to the irresponsibility of human beings, the masses of plastic and other plastics are carelessly thrown away into the open air, etc., after which they enter the waters, streams, rivers, and lakes, and are ultimately washed into the oceans. The whole thing then floats through the oceans as flotsam, mainly in the form of packaging, furniture remains, building and small parts, etc., as well as kilometer-long fishing or ghost nets. The UV radiation contained in sunlight and the mechanical disintegration caused by wave movements then tear the plastic into ever smaller fragments, which in the course of time are ultimately broken down into microscopically tiny nanoparticles. The degradation of lightweight plastics by natural processes usually takes well over 100 years, some even longer, depending on how resilient the plastic is, and consequently these nanotiny plastic particles are called persistent. In some ways, the toxic substances applied throughout the world inevitably also contaminate human beings and the entire living world, so that everything and everyone is affected by the toxins and becomes sick and sickly, which means death for many. Many will therefore eventually die from it. But also the whole of nature will be affected and many genera and species of fauna and flora will be wiped out, which, according to your Pliran investigations, currently number around 29,600. Toxins are substances that not only have a sickening and often deadly effect on all life forms existing in nature, but also on human beings, and that in the tiniest quantities. But this fact is 100% irresponsibly denied to the contrary by mendacious claims of manufacturers, politicians, and health authorities. Lying claims are made, whereby all those involved in the lies collect horrendous sums for their misleading statements of lies and thereby enrich themselves, that minimal amounts of the toxins are harmless to human beings, animals, creatures, and all life forms that are important to existence, and therefore do not pose a health risk. The fundamental fact is that the toxins that are constantly being invented and produced and spread into nature, its fauna and flora, and into the atmosphere, are becoming more and more dangerous for the existence of all life forms and thus also for human beings. This is because, as I said, they turn everything on the surface of the earth, in the soil and in all bodies of water, but also the atmosphere, into carriers of poison. As a result, all cultivated natural and also wild foods are poisoned from the ground up. And as a result, human beings and all living creatures for whom they serve as food inevitably absorb the toxins contained in all foodstuffs. Also by breathing in the air, because the atmosphere is also contaminated by all the huge masses of toxins and their toxic gases. So the fact is that all poisons of any kind are deposited in all plants, fruits, hides, berries, and vegetables of all genera, species and subspecies, etc., as well as in the atmosphere and thus in the air we breathe, after which they are subsequently absorbed by all life forms of all genera and species. Consequently, all existing life, likewise of all genera and species, will be contaminated with all kinds of toxins and struck with the resulting diseases, ailments, afflictions, and epidemics, whereby in the future, through all the toxins spread into the whole of nature and its fauna and flora, various types of cancer will also increase and will be the most frequent forms of disease, which will lead to the death of the human beings of the earth. And this will be so in addition to the fact that many vital life forms of the most diverse genera and species will continue to be wiped out, as has already happened in a catastrophic way and will also continue to happen in this way. And this will also happen in the future, and more, because Earth humans have become a generation of poisoners. And inevitably because the rapidly increasing overpopulation and the ever-increasing demand for food require an ever-increasing production of foodstuffs. So the growing urgency, in addition to the greed for profit of food producers and the entire bandwagon of food traders, to force and increase food production is in the foreground. And in nature, in garden farms, fields, forests, meadows and fields, etc., food, natural resources, natural products, foodstuffs and food should be produced. If foodstuffs, natural products, raw materials, edibles, food, foodstuffs, nutrients, rations, foodstuffs, nutrients, and food for the masses of overpopulation are to be produced, then this effectively requires a hellish production of ever-increasing quantities. For a long time now, the huge production of food can only be achieved by poisoning all pests with toxins that are deadly to them, but also by poisoning, killing, and exterminating all harmless and useful and even vital insects. All toxins, contrary to the false claims and lies of the manufacturers as well as the users of toxins, have a collective effect on everything that crawls and flies, as well as on all life forms involved, such as plants, animals, birds, lizards and mammals, etc., with regard to all genera and species and comprehensively in ways that are deadly or at least detrimental to health, as well as on the human beings. And not only in the last and later stages, but very early and quickly. The fact is that for decades now the enormous overpopulation can only be fed through evil Gevald measures and precisely dangerous and destructive machinations, such as the use of deadly and health-damaging poisons, through which a sufficiently high and sufficient food production can be achieved. This means that only an ever-increasing use of poisons against food pests can bring benefit to the ever-increasing food production. Whereby, however, everything in general will become ever more poisoned and bring ever worse consequences through poisoning, diseases and suffering in relation to all life. And this is also because not only the rapidly growing overpopulation requires more and more food, but also because the food producers are conscienceless and irresponsible in their aim to gain and accumulate immense fortunes through ever greater and more extensive production. However, they do not care at all that in the process they use toxic substances that are dangerous, deadly or pathogenic for all life forms, which on the one hand contaminate the food plants, and on the other hand also make human beings ill later on when they eat the plant products. Of course, it is true that pests can destroy entire harvests, so something has to be done about it. But this must not be done in such a way that not only effective pests are fought, killed, and made ill by dangerous, harmful or deadly toxins, but also many other useful life forms and even human beings. On the contrary, however, this is exactly what is being done, and life is being made ill, killed and destroyed that must be preserved, whereby the whole of poison spraying is undoubtedly proving to be a nasty vicious circle that the earthlings have created for themselves and can no longer extricate themselves from it because they continue to irresponsibly drive their overpopulation to ever higher heights. The whole thing of poison mixing and poison spreading could only end if humanity would finally radically stop and end its overpopulation growth once and for all, and then would limit a worldwide regulated birth control and thus a continuous further decrease of humanity to a reasonable level of ultimately at most 2 to 2.5 billion. The present overpopulation, as well as its masses over all the last 7 decades, has brought about a catastrophic level of toxins spreading into the whole of nature and its fauna and flora. As a result, the whole thing has already led to the irreparable and irrevocable extinction of various life forms, including species and genera that are extremely vital for all life, and this has caused serious gaps in the Earth's entire ecosystem. This already includes the entire ecological unity of all habitats, for the ecosystem is practically the ultimate for each and every one of all life forms and their possibility of life in general. The ecosystem, which is to be understood as the totality of the interrelationships between living beings and their environment and thus as the undisturbed household of nature and its fauna and flora, is founded as the smallest ecological unit of each habitat with all the living beings existing in it and inherent to it, which only guarantees the viability and possibility of life of each individual and also of all life forms in general. This vital system, however, has already been severely impaired and in part irreparably destroyed by the earthlings through their imbecilic overpopulation breeding, whereby they are now thoughtlessly and irresponsibly intending to drive everything into complete destruction in the future, through the further breeding of an even more extensive mass world overpopulation, and are also about to actually do so. Through the criminal machinations and manipulations of overpopulation, which will continue to grow unchecked and make everything much worse in the times to come. Because offspring after offspring will continue to be begotten, earthly dominion will ultimately go completely into overdrive and the whole world will fall into a hopeless chaos. And this will be the consequence because there will continue to be no worldwide, urgently necessary radical and total birth stop and no worldwide necessary rigorous birth control. This is because the irresponsibility of the earthlings argues that the whole business of having children is a private matter and has nothing to do with self-responsibility, nor with the well-being of the planet, nature, its fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate, with life itself, and therefore also not with the future possibility of existence of earthly humanity and of nature and its fauna and flora in general. As a result of the ever-increasing overpopulation and its predatory machinations with regard to the exploitation of Earth resources, everything will continue to increase catastrophically and ultimately lead to a disaster and an Earth-human tragedy. This is also stated by the resource calculator of the Wuppertal Institute, which for the first time raised the so-called Earth Overshoot Day on the 19th of December 1987, which was set for 1 year. This was done in order to determine a predicted Earth resource consumption for a period of 12 months. Since then, however, the massively increasing overpopulation and its machinations with regard to the exploitation of Earth resources have resulted in the date being brought forward significantly every year, because the defined amount of Earth resources is already exceeded months before the end of the defined year. As a result of which the Earth's resources continue to be exploited and consumed irresponsibly far beyond the defined measure. As I know, the International Global Footprint Network calculates every year the significant day when the Earth's resource consumption of mankind overtakes the regenerability of our ecosystems. To which, however, you said, and I agree, that this estimated regenerability is absolutely illusory. In fact, fundamentally, the present and future Earthlings are living in debt to all future generations with regard to the use of Earth resources. This year 2018, too, another record was broken worldwide, as Overshoot Day took place much earlier in practically all states, as has been the case year after year and will also be the case in the future. In 2018, for example, the resource limit was already exceeded in Europe on the 1st of August, and therefore since then people have already been living on the consumption account of the next period and thus on credit. Compared to the previous year, Earth Overshoot Day has therefore again moved to the front, as it has steadily done before, instead of the earthly overpopulation humanity having committed itself to global justice and the preservation of livelihoods. Actually, the eco account in Europe was already overdrawn on the 2nd of May 2018, whereby the reason for this lies particularly in the high CO2 emissions in the areas of energy, transport, construction, all motor sports and in industrial gardening and agriculture, as well as in the very high land use in relation to the numerically enormous cattle farming for meat production. Especially with regard to the mass production of meat for overpopulation. It is to be borne in mind that, according to your very precise clear-in data, more than 1.24 billion or over 1,240 million cattle are kept and fattened on Earth for meat production. The fact is that every time a cow burps or lets off wind, it emits methane. Methane, however, is a potent greenhouse gas that, calculated over 10 decades or 100 years, as Twelfth has already explained to me, heats up the climate about 27 times more than CO2 is able to do. So the huge mass of cattle worldwide is also partly to blame for climate change. But this is basically due to the machinations and manipulations of overpopulation, which continues to copulate and ensure that it continues to grow more and more rapidly. Apart from all the disastrous overpopulation machinations in relation to the enormous methane gas production by cattle, it would be particularly and especially important to curb and minimize CO2 production as quickly as possible in every possible way. However, this would require drastic measures with regard to the delusion of madness of all those Earthlings who live with the illusion that they could not exist without explosion engine vehicles, but to whom such vehicles would have to be banned and only allowed to those who need the utility vehicles. Well, I think that with regard to CO2 reduction, for example, it would be extremely necessary and particularly important for natural CO2 storage facilities to be built and for such projects to be promoted. I am thinking here, among other things, of bogs and swamps that have dried up naturally or have been stupidly drained by human beings, which would be of particular importance for storing CO2 through bog rewetting or swamp rewetting. In this respect, I am thinking of natural and anthropogenic or human influences on the carbon stocks in the soils. In particular, I believe that the re-wetting of degraded and, in my opinion, drained moor and swamp sites would be beneficial and necessary. This is because the re-wetting of peatlands and marshes would bring a lot of benefits. Because, as Twelfth explained when he talked about what will happen in the future in this regard, and I can logically understand his explanations, the climate impact of peatlands and marshes is very significant. A moor re-wetting and marsh re-wetting, that is to say a water resaturation of the moors and marshes, your father's Twelfth explained to me, would restore their natural state and important function, because moors and marshes and the like would store carbon dioxide and thus contribute to climate protection. However, the more the water level was lowered by a natural drought or natural disaster, or by humanly stupid drainage and draining, the more the organic substances in the form of peat would be decomposed by microbial activities, or processes caused by microbes, whereby more climate-damaging carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide would be released. As I have learned from SPA, peatlands and marshes provide very important conditions that are of great significance for the entire ecosystem, and the following 5 points are particularly important in this context. If I still remember his explanations correctly, moors and swamps and the like form a biodiversity protection, which is of very special importance, because biodiversity exists in habitats which contain many specialized genera and species and which receive the necessary substances for their existence and possibility of life through the effects of water resaturation in moors and swamps and the like. Moors and swamps and the like, with their peat etc., are extremely important long-term carbon reservoirs. On the one hand, moors and swamps and the like are water escape reservoirs and thus, among other things, flood protection, as well as reservoirs and filters in relation to the water balance. Moors and swamps and the like have an effect on the local and regional climate by spreading cooling all around and acting like a cooling device. Moors and swamps and the like offer many kinds of functional areas for many life forms of various genera and species, such as living space for many life forms, for reproduction, for food and as protection, but also for the human being's recreational and adventure space. The atmosphere above bogs and swamps and the like absorbs a large part of the heat radiation that rises from the earth. But this is partly radiated back to the Earth's surface, which forms the so-called greenhouse effect. However, a distinction must be made between this natural greenhouse effect and the anthropogenic greenhouse effect or the greenhouse effect caused by human beings. Because without the natural greenhouse effect, life on Earth would not be possible. I should explain that solar radiation penetrates the outermost layers of the Earth, with the ozone layer being the most important, followed by the atmospheric layers. There is not only one of these, as is usually assumed in ignorance by many human beings, because in reality there are several. Namely the first, which is called the troposphere and which exists as the lowest layer of the Earth's atmosphere, followed by the stratosphere, which is arranged above the tropopause. Above the stratosphere in turn follows the third, the mesosphere, and above this as the fourth the thermosphere, which extends from 85 to 500 kilometers above the ground, after which then follows the exosphere. If the air is taken into account, it becomes thinner and thinner above the mesosphere because the Earth's gravitational pull weakens with increasing altitude and therefore the air particles or gas particles can hold on less and less. So the thermosphere, in which very high temperatures of up to 1,700 degrees prevail, forms a smooth transition into space over hundreds of kilometers. I must also explain, while I'm at it, that heat radiation is converted at the Earth's surface, but is emitted again by the Earth, although the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere prevent some of this heat radiation from escaping into space. If the atmosphere did not have this protective shield, the Earth would have effectively frozen into an eternal ball of ice at -18 degrees Celsius long ago. So the natural greenhouse effect is a guarantee that a global mean temperature of about 15 degrees Celsius prevails on the planet, which also ensures that life could develop at all on good Mother Earth and that it can continue to exist. Always provided that the crazy and irresponsible Earthlings do not drive everything into the ultimate catastrophe of self-destruction and destruction of the planet with their insane overpopulation. The greenhouse effect, which was caused by anthropogenic or human influence and also climate change, will also contribute to this possibility. Above all, this is caused by the overpopulation-related machinations and manipulations in relation to the exploitation and misuse of the Earth's resources. The burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and natural gas, as well as the clearing of forests, are of particular importance, but also the changes in landscapes and the incorrect use of land, as well as the alteration of streams, rivers, lakes, meadows, seashores, hills and mountains, etc., have irreparably destroyed the entire course of nature and will continue to do so. Due to the inexorably growing overpopulation, whereby the planet Earth, with all the good and best possibilities of life, is ideally designed for 529 million, but at most for 2.5 billion human beings, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has increased very strongly in the last 150 years. Whereby, moreover, since 1950 everything has increased to excess and from then on it has become more and more overbearing. Today's global atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, which figures as the most important and most dangerous greenhouse gas, has risen from about 280 ppm Wikipedia equals parts per million. That is to say 280 CO2 molecules per 1 million air molecules, in pre-industrial times to 420 ppm, according to the figure you gave me last week, Ptaah. The concentration of the greenhouse gas methane, produced by intensified agriculture and livestock, especially cattle, has more than doubled since the blatant overpopulation increase from 1950 onwards according to your statement until today in 2018. As a result, the present concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is so great that far too much heat is stored, which inevitably has considerable consequences for the world climate, whereby your clear explanations and research results state, according to your explanations, that 94.7% and thus the largest part of the global warming of the last decades, especially from 1950 onwards, is due to the greenhouse gas emissions caused by human beings. This has resulted from overpopulation in terms of its further increased CO2 production machinations in relation to this, because millions of young human beings came into adulthood and so did millions of new users of vehicles with internal combustion engines, which further increased CO2 emissions, as will continue to be the case every year. This in addition to many more cattle and other animals and creatures that produce methane gas and thus also pollute and poison the atmosphere and thus the air we breathe. As you have explained, Switzerland scores particularly badly with regard to Earth Overshoot Day and resource abuse, because the Swiss Earth Overshoot in terms of resource abuse lasted only just 3 months of the scheduled year, until the set measure was already exceeded on the 7th of May 2018, and since then Switzerland has been plodding along on credit and abusing Earth resources that should not be needed until next year. If the entire world population were to live in such a way and irresponsibly squander Earth resources as the population of Switzerland does, then the Earth resources of 3 Earths would already have to be exploited today. The overpopulation itself, as a result of its gathering together in the increasingly precarious and scarce living space, will cause the Earthlings to get on each other's nerves more and more. On the one hand, this will lead to increasing quarrels and discontent between neighbors and residents, and on the other hand, contagious diseases and epidemics will spread, both old ones that will mutate and new ones. And various of these diseases and epidemics will increase in number because they will be spread by poisons of many kinds through the drinking water and the waters as well as through the atmosphere and will seriously affect the health of human beings. But also the air, the soil, the food, trees, shrubs, fields, forests, gardens, and even everything that grows in the greenhouses. And all efforts to change for the better will be in vain to counteract and stop all the evils. For they will become greater and more disastrous from day to day, even from hour to hour and minute to minute, in relation to the rapidly increasing and still exploding overpopulation. And all that has already happened in this respect and will continue to come unchecked was and is the fault, unreasonableness and irresponsibility of the human beings of Earth. And so it will also be in the future through the further irresponsible breeding of overpopulation. That which has already been destroyed cannot be resurrected, just as that which has remained intact can no longer be preserved, because all efforts in this regard will be in vain and therefore useless as a result of the overpopulation growth. Because Earth humans, due to a lack of intellect, rationality, and responsibility, do not come to the correct conclusion that only a rigorous reduction of earthly humanity can still save something. But this can only be done by a controlled birth stop of several years and a subsequent and likewise worldwide controlled and unlimited birth control. And effectively, the only correct decision is that overpopulation is radically stopped by a preceding worldwide birth stop and a worldwide following unlimited birth control. And that as a consequence, earthly mankind is reduced to a level that is in accordance with the planet and nature. And this measure must be calculated according to nature and the planet Earth itself at 529 million human beings. Whereby this number may be exceeded, but in the maximum case may not exceed 2.5 billion. These numbers, however, were calculated in such a way that this number of human beings could have existed and lived without any problems for all times according to the Earth's nutritional capacity and its entire resources. This, however, while at the present time Earth humans, who have long since overbred, have made their planet so ill, destroyed and exploited it that it is only wasting away and heading for a state that will ultimately lead to the inability of humanity to live. If it does not learn and develop reason, rationality, and sufficient intelligentum to save what can still be saved. If we look at the machinations and manipulations of the governments, as well as those of the so-called experts and scientists who deal with climate protection, then we have to conclude that all these experts are nothing but absolute incompetence. Zeros and rivets, because they neither perceive the effective truth and reality nor recognize its reality, and therefore cannot understand anything at all about what is effective. And just as they go about their lives blindly and stupidly in this way, because they are only concerned about themselves and their own well-being and financial cushion, they also hegemonically dictatorially direct the states to which they are placed and which they should actually be exemplary, supportive, and beneficial to. However, since the majority of those in power, which, according to your Ptaah analyses, amounts to 98.7%, as you said the other day, lack all abilities and other prerequisites for governance, right down to the parties, there is misgovernment worldwide. Due to a lack of intellect, rationality, and intelligentum, those in charge of the governments and their vassals and the parties etc., as well as their stupid and clueless fellow roarers from the peoples, neither recognize nor understand in any way that overpopulation alone is to blame for all the processes on Earth. In nature, fauna and flora, the climate change and the resulting natural disasters, as well as with regard to all the diseases and epidemics rampant in humanity. Moreover, you clear and judge the earthly governments and their fellow howlers to be the greatest criminals in them, who bring disaster upon the earthlings, while they are cheered to the skies with praise and adulation by the ignorant masses of the populations at all times. The machinations and manipulations, etc. alone, which are carried out by the immense masses of overpopulation, will result in the fact that at 000 hours on the 31st of December 2018 the human race has increased to 8,953,851,418 human beings, which shows an increase of 109,723,416 Earth humans for the year 2017. Have arisen and continue to arise through the fault of humanity irreparable or almost irreparable destruction, annihilation and extinction with regard to nature, fauna and flora, the climate, the atmosphere and the planet itself. All this can be traced back to the machinations and manipulations of the immense mass of Earth humans, to all disasters, evils, unrest, hatred, injustice, unpeace, unfreedom, wars, crimes, and all other Ausertangen, of every kind and kind, as also in relation to climate change and the resulting enormous storms and natural disasters of many dimensions. If the irresponsible and irresponsible rulers and their vassals etc., as well as those calling themselves scientists, experts, or other know-it-alls hold climate conferences, at which the most expensive food and booze binges are probably the most important thing, then there is only a lot of stupid and imbecilic palaver, after which equally stupid and imbecilic and completely useless resolutions are passed. On the one hand, all these senseless resolutions at climate conferences etc. bring no benefit whatsoever and are just as thoughtless as other planning of all kinds, which is supposed to solve already existing and new emerging problems. And the whole thing is pointless because the 100 to 110 million mass of overpopulation, which continues to increase every year, as well as the 100 to 110 million mass of people growing up and becoming capable of procreation, are entering the cycle of progressive destruction, annihilation, and extinction on the planet. This is particularly the case, on the one hand, through the new use of millions of explosive motor vehicles that continue to come into operation, and, on the other hand, with regard to overpopulation and its increase, which is additionally continued by already older adults by means of copulation for the production of offspring. These problems alone are not considered, nor are many other urgencies, because all the climate conference participants are in no way educated in all the necessities that arise and would be necessary to bring a climate conference to the crux of the matter, from which they could work out and bring effective, helpful solutions, order and initiate what is correct, which would then have to be carried out. And in this respect, the first thing to do would be to work out and enact a worldwide legal birth stop for 7 years, after which a birth regulation for an unlimited period of time would have to be introduced to reduce overpopulation and then prevent it from reoccurring. Of course, this would also require a worldwide enlightenment of all Earth humans, and that comprehensively in a way of revealing the facts, providing solutions, unveiling and exposing the facts, informing and initiating into the truth and informing with regard to the need for insight, instructing, imparting knowledge and raising the awareness of the population. So there is a need for the instruction of the individual human beings of the earth with regard to perceiving, recognizing, building up, understanding and comprehending personal responsibility. Just as the climate conferences bring nothing in terms of ameliorative change, because only nonsensical speeches are made and moronic useless resolutions are put forward, which bring absolutely no success and thus not one iota for climate improvement, so it goes in the same way with practically all private organizations that clamor for climate salvation. This will also be the case, as you said some time ago, when in the near future new young people's groups will emerge and demonstratively demand that governments and all those responsible should do something at all to save the climate. These young groups that will appear in the near future will also only make empty and stupid speeches and demand measures to save the climate. But in their youthful ignorance, they will also not know or understand what the effective cause and the resulting machinations and maneuvers of the whole thing are. These young human beings also do not know and do not investigate these causes, but they all only see the effects and consequently do nothing to end the climate disaster, but will only lead stupid discussions and speeches, shout and scream around and do not make an effort to find the necessary solutions. So also these young human beings, like the rulers and climate conference leaders and the other know-it-alls and experts who behave arrogantly and imagine themselves to be gods, will only talk stupid and make demands without looking for the root cause of all evils, catastrophes and destructions, and finding the solution to fix the whole thing. Particularly those climate conference participants who consider themselves expert scientists, but who are effectively zeros and rivets in this respect, shout for new measures to stop climate change, although this is impossible with their nonsensical demands. The fact that politicians and governments and clueless environmental organizations go along with this and howl in support of the whole thing, which can never lead to success, also proves their stupidity, lack of sense and reason, and their inferior intelligentum. They too do not find the cause of the sword of Damocles that is already falling down and that for decades has been bringing evil, terror, destruction, horror, blessings, visitations, dangers, catastrophes, collapses, destructions, annihilations and extinctions. The whole of the origin of the destruction of the climate and the poisoning of nature, its fauna, flora, waters, and atmosphere will ultimately lead inevitably and finally to defeat for Earth humans. This is because all those responsible on Earth, the governments, politicians, scientists, religions, sects, various organizations, and the majority of Earth humans, do not make up their minds to introduce a worldwide birth stop fixed for 7 years and then a worldwide controlled birth control in order to reduce the Earth's population and ultimately bring it back to a normal Earth-compatible level. Stupid, pompous and moronically ignorant speeches, however, lead nowhere, and all those who behave arrogantly and fancy themselves as gods do not give a thought to what the real cause of climate change is. The origin of the whole thing is undoubtedly overpopulation and the machinations and manipulations arising from it, which have led and continue to lead to all the Ausertungen that are currently and will also in the future result in ever more destructive and devastating and even deadly natural disasters worldwide. According to your explanations, the groups of young human beings who will soon emerge, who will cry out for climate rescue and who will talk about themselves, and who have no idea whatsoever about the real causes of climate destruction, will achieve nothing. They will not be able to do anything about the necessary measures with their stupid arguments, because they have no idea about them, just as the climate conference participants do not have a clue with their idiotic gibberish and their moronic resolutions. A positive influence on the climate can only be achieved if all toxic substances of all kinds, which have to be comprehensively destroyed, as well as the gigantic masses of CO2 and the enormous quantities of methane gas, are drastically reduced. These are precisely the substances that have a destructive, annihilating and exterminating effect on nature, its fauna and flora, the oceans and freshwaters, as well as having a detrimental effect on the atmosphere and the climate, and also on the human beings who fall ill and ultimately die as a result of all this. The fact that only a radical reduction to zero of all the countless toxins of all kinds that have been spread throughout nature and its flora can bring an initial and ultimately good success is neither recognized nor understood and consequently not even taken into consideration. Also to be mentioned in particular are the enormous masses of CO2 emissions and the huge masses of methane gas, which, together with the industrial chimney emissions, are the largest and most important destructive factors in climate change and thus effectively play the main role in the whole climate disaster or climate destruction. For this is what it is. Not just climate change, as the whole thing is deceptively and misleadingly presented to humanity by expert scientists and the irresponsible people in charge. Therefore, all explosion engine vehicles, aeroplanes and ships etc., which are operated with combustion engines and products such as petrol and diesel oil, as well as oil heaters etc., must be reduced radically, but in a sensible and controlled manner. Add to this the millions of vehicles equipped with internal combustion engines, but only stupidly used for sporting purposes and moronically used for driving around, polluting the air we breathe and increasingly affecting the climate through huge CO2 emissions. The entire quantity of all vehicles powered by explosion engines amounts to billions, which, however, contrary to reason and responsibility towards the climate, are being put more and more into circulation. As a result of which the climate and the entire environment, nature, its fauna and flora as well as the atmosphere are being increasingly polluted and destroyed. In addition, due to the increasing overpopulation, from which the whole of all evils, destructions and destructions as well as extinctions fundamentally originate, new millions of such vehicles are added every year, which lead more and more to the impairment of the climate, nature, its fauna and flora, as well as the oceans, fresh waters, and to the illness of the Earth's population as well as to the extinction of numerous vital life forms of many genera and species. Further, the entire food production is to be mentioned, which in its worldwide immense mass can only be produced by the use of chemical toxins of all kinds, be it in this respect on the one hand by food impairing and these poisoning growth stimulants, or by plant protection agents in relation to the control of pests attacking all kinds of plants, such as insects, animals or rodents, etc., but also to be protected against diseases such as fungal infestations, etc., and the more humans populate the world, the more such toxins are spread, because the endlessly growing human race needs more and more food of all kinds, as well as innumerable other necessities, the types of which it is impossible for me to list, but the production and effects of which ultimately have a destructive effect on nature, its fauna and flora, and very often a pathogenic and even deadly effect on human beings. Unfortunately, the fact of our time is that not only in the great mass of human beings, but also in individual cases, two human beings can hardly or not at all talk to each other sensibly or even communicate with each other in a valuable way in the family or in a small circle. The result is that the effective truth of life and of all things is neither reasonably nor intelligently fathomed, let alone talked about or discussed at all, because already from the ground up no valuable mediation can be brought about. As a result, it has also become impossible for conciliatory mediation to take place among human beings, but rather, in relation to the increasing overpopulation, the longer, the more only unkindness, indifference, enmity, hatred, violence, mistrust and envy, etc., will prevail. Inexorably, all Earth humans are becoming strangers to each other, even in their own families and in their nearest neighbors, while all the unworthy values are spreading inexorably among all Earth humans. And this results in particular from the religious and sectarian delusion of faith in God, through which brotherhood and sisterhood, peace, freedom, love and equality are preached and lied about in the foreground in everyday life, as well as in every soul-launching pad or on every pulpit of every church, in every temple, in every synagogue, in every mosque and in every other so-called house of God. This, while in reality in truth all that is babbled about corresponds only to empty phrases of no value. 16. If the whole thing is viewed sharply and correctly in a truthful manner, then it can be seen in a regrettable and frightening way that everything is just smoke and mirrors and that religions, sects and the resulting faith are fundamentally the origin of enmity, hatred, discord, lack of freedom, war, violence, discord, destruction and ruin. And this results in particular from the religious sectarian diversities of the religious and sectarian doctrines, their rituals, prayers, beliefs, views and opinions and behavior, etc. The differences in religions, sects and beliefs create discord and hatred among the believers as a result of the different religions, sects, in which leads to acts of violence, acts of terror and wars, whereby no believing human being gives even the slightest thought to reality and its truth. Consequently, no human being who is delusional about God also knows what suggestive nonsense he has fallen prey to with his delusion of faith. Every belief, especially religious sectarian belief, stands in stark contrast to real or factual reality, from which alone the concrete effective truth emerges, which alone as provable and verifiable knowledge verifies its correctness flawlessly, irrefutably, and incontestably. A belief in the truth of a thing or of anything, without the immediate possibility of clear proof and thus of verification, especially with regard to a religious belief in a God or in anything else religious, is never founded in an effectively provable knowledge that can only arise from a fact of real reality. In human beings, faith corresponds on the one hand to giving up one's own thinking, one's own insights and decision-making, one's personal opinion forming and one's very own responsibility. On the other hand, the whole thing in this respect is based on the fact that, as a result of faith, primarily a turning away from reality takes place, whereby reality is no longer perceived, nor is the only truth existing in it. The result is that the necessary attention is no longer paid to effective reality and its only existing truth, but rather to the imagination or the delusion of faith that is alien to reality, which pretends to have supernatural insights and knowledge. The whole of this, and consequently the fact of faith, is thus founded in an unobjective perception of an illusion, which can only come about through a weakness of intellect, rationality, and intelligentum. I have already said once that when it comes to the empty phrases of the preachers of God being put into practice and lived, everything then evaporates into smoke and mirrors, and the whole thing turns out to be nothing more than idiotic, stupid, empty talk, from which, however, those who listen to the preachers of God make a profit. And they do this because they are considered good believers who diligently go to the house of God and listen to the word of God. After which, however, when they have to take on their daily troubles again in the everyday life of reality, they get angry about it and express and show their true outer and inner being again. And they do this by harassing, harrying, insulting and, if possible, materially damaging or even psychologically or physically injuring the enmity, aversion and hatred that blaze within them against their fellow human beings, people of other faiths, certain groups, and those who are richer and wealthier than they are, in every possible way. And the more extensive the overpopulation grows, the more human beings fall prey to these ways of life and behavior. For with the growth of the world's population, all evil happenings of all kinds expand into steadily worse consequences. For the greater the rate of overpopulation increases, the more discord and unfreedom, indifference and injustice, as well as strife, envy and ill will, hatred, enmity, and violent violence in all relationships and directions increase among human beings, from which, in the end, wars and terrorism are the catastrophic consequences. 11. The growing overpopulation and the resulting machinations, manipulations and maneuvers of various kinds also bring nature and the whole earth, the atmosphere and the climate into turmoil, causing damage and destruction, as a result of which these are not only increasingly impaired in their function, but are slowly but surely irreparably destroyed and even finally annihilated and, in addition, the most diverse life forms, which are important for all life, are hopelessly wiped out. The creational natural laws and recommendations are written in the Goblet of the Truth, etc. Also in the Teaching of the Spirit as Teaching of the Truth, Teaching of the Spirit, Teaching of Life, the observance of which is of vital importance for humanity. However, only very few human beings care about this, because the great masses are not interested in it, but only in pushing overpopulation further and thus destroying the earth, its nature, fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate and ultimately the planet. By irresponsibly and criminally exploiting the earth's resources to the last possible usable one and thereby also throwing the earth out of balance and causing it to egg in its course around the sun. Furthermore, the forests are also being robbed, deforested, and destroyed by the machinations of overpopulation in order to satisfy all kinds of unnecessary needs of mankind. In the process, more and more fertile land is also being destroyed for housing and new workplaces, factories, roads, sports fields and amusement parks and all kinds of other unnecessary necessities, whereby the habitats of nature and its fauna and flora, and of course also for the earthlings, are becoming fewer and more precarious, just as the climate is being increasingly affected and destroyed by toxic emissions. The unstoppable increase in overpopulation brings about many other disadvantages that have an extremely negative effect on the whole of humanity, such as poverty, which is becoming ever more profound and widespread and is inexorably spreading further and further into the population. This also has the undeniable effect of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. This, however, causes ever greater and more insoluble social problems, as well as problems with regard to the livelihood and coexistence of human beings, because the wealth of some and the poverty of other human beings creates an enormous discrepancy or disproportion between the rich and the poor, as a result of which they cannot have an equal social relationship with each other. This, however, creates discord and hatred and inevitably leads to violence, which increases more and finally becomes so violent that it results in murder and manslaughter and destruction. In the world, or at least in many countries, poverty means that human beings have no roof over their heads, nothing or only scanty food, no medical care and often also no social rights. If, on the other hand, poverty is considered in Switzerland, then being poor is usually understood to mean that one's wages are not enough to cover one's living expenses. For example, that a human being cannot afford health insurance, adequate housing, or a visit to the dentist because everything is unaffordable for him or her. However, this also means that the human being living in poverty excludes himself from society or is excluded by others, which inevitably leads to a lack of contact with other human beings. Exclusion from society, however, causes a lack of perspective and promotes further and ever worse negative effects, which, however, are very often hidden. I know that in 2016, more than 1.2 million human beings in Switzerland were affected by poverty or at risk of poverty, of which 1/4 were children and young people on the one hand, and an above-average number of single parents and families with 3 or more children on the other. This also included a large number of human beings with little or no vocational training who, after losing their jobs, were inevitably unable to find new work and therefore became poor, which is now simply referred to as social recipients. However, at that time, that is to say in 2016, there were also 140,000 women and men who were probably in gainful employment, but were still considered poor and were therefore referred to as the working poor. So with regard to poverty in Switzerland, it must be said that it is absolutely not a marginal phenomenon, not even today in 2018, and not because being poor compared to earlier times, when in the strictest sense of the word it effectively meant the deepest suffering, misery in every respect, is today defined as financial destitution, neediness, lack of possessions, deprivation, lack of money or shortage of money. Today, this is defined as financial destitution, lack of possessions, deprivation, lack of money or shortage of money, poverty, social impoverishment, destitution, poverty, hardship, and bankruptcy. A person affected by poverty in Switzerland is estimated to have a maximum of 2,600 Swiss francs per month at his or her disposal, with approximately 986 Swiss francs left over in the case of low-cost housing and after deduction of the health insurance premium. This must be used to pay for food, clothing, communication, energy consumption, ongoing household management, health care, transport expenses, entertainment and education, personal hygiene, as well as any club fees and hobbies, and so on. I have experienced what poverty actually is in many countries and also realized that living in poverty means much more than having no money and not being able to afford or buy many things. Therefore, I would like to say something about this so that it is understood when a human being is considered poor. This is because it depends on which country he or she lives in, because that determines, for example, their financial means and possibilities they have with or without money. Furthermore, poverty is to be divided into different levels, which is usually not known to the majority of humanity. Consequently, I have to explain something about this as well. Material poverty in many countries, there are many poor human beings, whereby poverty for them means that they have a lack of all conceivable essential and necessary things, predominantly not enough food, no warm clothing, and no housing suitable for them. So this form of poverty also means that the human beings do not have enough money. On the one hand, this is because they do not earn enough through their work, if they have such a job, or because they are paid inferior wages, or because they are unemployed. Attention poverty. This form of poverty means that the human being receives too little attention and care, because interpersonal relationships have atrophied to such an extent that there is no longer any respect or consideration for the neighbor, and alienation from one human being to another has become the order of the day. In the last decades, an increasingly blatant emergence has been observed in this respect, an inattention and lack of attention towards fellow human beings, which is also becoming more and more widespread today and in the future, making human beings poorer and poorer in terms of good interpersonal relationships. But this also means that there are more and more poor children who, outside the parental home, are only treated lovelessly by their fellow human beings without attention and affectionate care, who are spat on and insulted, which leads to their being retaliated against or intimidated, and ultimately to rebellion and asocialism. This inevitably arises when other persons in their immediate or wider circle engage in extremely unfair and mean machinations against them, turning them into anti-socialists. In this wise, children become poor because of various negative machinations on them by known or unknown adults or even their parents, making them poor in terms of attention and care. Emotional poverty. Parents and adult relatives very often spend less and less time with their children and godchildren, etc. And in many cases it is also the case that they themselves are completely incapable of emotions, as a result of which they cannot show affection to their children and godchildren either. This means that they do not listen to the children, just as they cannot take them in their arms or comfort them when they are sad or distressed. Therefore, whenever children are neglected and left alone, we must speak of emotional poverty. As is the case with children, it is also the case with parents or other adults. For all adult human beings also have the same natural impulses within them, even if they have suppressed them in the course of their lives through all kinds of negative and evil moral precipitation and have sunk them into a deep abyss. But they continue to exist underground and can be awakened again. Sociocultural poverty at the social level. Human beings who do not conform to the sociological norm are usually excluded from society, and this norm also applies to human beings who live in material poverty. So it is that these human beings, because they are poor and have no money, etc., also do not participate in community leisure activities or cultural activities such as concerts, any other performances or events, etc., because their being poor excludes them from everything social. The most frequent cause of sociocultural poverty is also based on unemployment, as can also be the case with other forms of poverty. In various countries this is particularly the case because there is not enough work for all human beings, precisely because on the one hand the mass of overpopulation has more human beings than there are jobs, while on the other hand the countries are already overcrowded and overloaded with jobs in every conceivable possible field of work. This means that the entire infrastructure is already overloaded, precisely the necessary economic and organizational substructure that is indispensable as a prerequisite for the supply and utilization of the entire area and comprehensively for the economy of the country in question. Of course, human beings can also become unemployed because they have to leave and give up their jobs as a result of bankruptcy or other abandonment of the enterprise. But it is also the case that many human beings work diligently all day long but still do not earn enough, as a result of which their wages are not enough to feed themselves or their families and pay for everything they need. And this sometimes does not happen even if a small income is earned additionally through a side job. But even with this, the necessary allowance is still not enough to be able to pay for everything. Too little pay alone can not only be the cause of material poverty, because if additional work is done, this can also lead to human beings not being able to spend enough time with their families, which causes serious relationship problems, because too much work has to be done. So this often leads to family hardship and problems that can trigger various forms of poverty, such as problems of alienation in relation to spouses and children, which ultimately leads to the separation or divorce of the parents, as well as when money is scarce, when the wage income of one or both partners is not enough for living expenses, rent, health insurance, and all other necessities.